Hang out with me today as we paint this cozy little cafe with watercolor and some line art. I really like using just one brush when I can, so with this painting I'm primarily going to do it with this Princeton Heritage round brush in size 6. Holbein is my favorite brand of watercolor, so I'm going to start out my first screen doing a kind of blend of some sap green with some shadow green watered down a little bit, and then I'll keep kind of tweaking the color as we go to give some variety to my plants and my greens. A lot of the time, I find it kind of helpful to just start out with a basic shape of what I want my plant to be, and then from there, I can add different dimension and more colors as it dries a little bit more. That way, it keeps kind of changing and looks a little bit more realistic as we go. For these flowers on top of the roof, I'm starting out with the flowers first. That way I will place the greenery after so it doesn't mix up too much. But I'm working with a blend of mineral blue and quinacridone magenta for those original purple flower colors. And down here I'm doing another blend of shadow green and sap green, but a little bit heavier on the sap green than the shadow green. Now that this bushier plant has dried a little bit, but not all the way, I'm going in and adding a little bit more dimension with some more shadow green to just give it another layer of depth. I like playing around and doing this at different times, so some of the plants I'll add in other colors right away while they're still pretty wet, and other plants I'll wait until they dry a little bit just to give different effects and kind of play with how it looks and just have different dimension to the different plants. For this bush plant, I didn't want the flowers to have the same kind of focus as they do for the plants that are going to be on the roof. So I added some quinacridone magenta and a little bit of marine blue after the fact when the leaves have already been painted. So you can see that it just gives a different effect than it's going to give on the roof where the flowers were painted first. I'm blending some colors here for this greenery, again, the sap green and the shadow green, but you can tell which one is the stronger one each time I paint because sap green is more that brighter, a little bit more lime green, yellowy green, and the shadow green is that darker, deeper, richer one. So you can see that I keep kind of changing which one's the prominent one in different places to give depth to that plant. Another reason why I like mixing multiple greens is because I can get kind of a custom blend of a color that still coordinates for each different plant so that they can stand out against each other and they don't look like exactly the same plants painted exactly the same way every single time. So on this one, it's obviously more shadow green because I just wanted it to be different than the two plants that it's right next to. One of the secrets I've found that really helps your watercolor paintings look more cohesive and like they really go together, all the colors that you use, is to just keep using the same blends and just change them a little bit. So these flowers are actually the same two colors as the flowers on the roof, but I just changed the ratio of how much of the two pigments I use. So this one has a stronger amount of quinacridone magenta compared to the marine blue. And so it still really goes and coordinates with the flowers on the roof, but they're just different and they still stand out a little bit and have some dynamic little changes to them and they don't look exactly the same, but they look really nice together. And that's something that I do a lot. I'll pick either like one unifying color like yellow ochre and I mix it into all of my other paints that I'm going to use for that picture, or I'll just keep using the same blends just in different ratios. Another thing I've learned when you're painting, buildings, especially in this style, you don't want the colors on the walls to be perfectly smooth and even because it'll look a little bit weird. So you want to kind of do it a little bit messy and add different amounts of pigment to different spots so it gives a little bit more of a realistic textured type of feel to it, and it's not just this perfectly smooth super even wash that doesn't have any changes or shadows or texture or anything like that to it. Perfection definitely kind of harms you when you're painting in this style. So you want to let some of the loose and free natural things that the water just does on its own, you want to let those things happen and definitely not chase perfection on this. For the background of this shop, inside the little window of the cafe, I took some yellow ochre and I mixed it with a kind of dried out older mix that I already had on my palette that was indigo and marine blue, and just mixed it so it kind of made this little bit muddy coffee shop type of color. And I want this background to just be kind of soft and blurry and not take all the focus from the picture because it's not really the main point. It's just supposed to be this subtle little background. When I first started with watercolor, I used to try and keep my palette super clean and white with all my colors very separated and organized, and I would wipe it clean so I could start brand new for each project. But with time, I found that I don't actually like what happens when I do that, and I've found a lot more positive surprises when I just kind of leave paint from other projects and I let things kind of mix together and make their own little blends and creations. And overall, I like the effect it gives a lot more because things just feel a little bit more cohesive and like they go together. And I've been able to come up with lots of colors that I wouldn't have thought to mix before, but they just kind of happened on accident. And I really like it. Right here, I'm using a blend of some yellow ochre, some of that leftover marine blue indigo blend, and then a little bit of sepia from also from Holbein. The sepia color adds a little bit of richness and a darker brown to things so that it pops out a little bit from the background, the little front frame of this cute little shop. I'm going to use the same technique as before for the pots, where I'll pick one primary blend that I'm going to use, and then I'll just subtly tweak the ratios of it so that every pot doesn't look exactly the same, but they still really go together because they're very similar colors. The ratio is just tweaked slightly, and it really helps each plant stand on its own, but still fit the overall picture without any glaring, like sore thumb looking distractions that stand out too much. So on these, I'm using that same blend that we used for the shop with the yellow ochre with a little bit of blue, but then I'm adding in a little bit more sepia and a tiny bit of Payne's gray to this to add some dimension. So they're still primarily brown, but the Payne's gray, especially on this one on the side, adds some blue gray into it to give more of the change. So not everything is exactly the same, but they still really work together. When you're painting stacked objects like these little teacups, it's really important to remember to let your water layers dry as much as possible, otherwise things will run together. So on these, there's 4 cups stacked, and I did the bottom cup and the third cup so that they can dry a little bit before I paint a color into those other 2 white spaces for the second and fourth cup. Because if I did it all at once, it would just be a giant color blob and it wouldn't really work out. So that's something that's really important to not forget when you're trying to paint things that are right next to each other. Just give it time. For these little hanging fairy light type things, I did another technique because I wasn't sure how I wanted to show that they were lights. So initially I painted them with primarily yellow ochre in a solid little round, and then I rinsed off my brush, dried it off, and I started lifting the center to remove some of that paint because the paint goes to the driest thing, and in that case, or in this case, that's my brush. So the paint leaves the paper and goes to the brush, and I can dry it off and do that over and over. So it gives that kind of light glow in the center of these bulbs. Now we're ready to paint the awning, and I did a really similar color that I used on the front of the building, just slightly less of a gray tinge to it and a little bit more prominent on the blue. A reminder that this awning is similar to the front of the building, and we don't want it to be a perfectly even, exactly smooth wash because then it will look a little strange. We want it to have a little bit of shadow, a little texture, and dry to where it's just not perfect because then it'll give it a little bit more of a realistic vibe to it. I'm putting the blue color a little bit into the plants so that it looks like the awning can be seen through the little cracks between the leaves and stuff as well. One of the fun things that I appreciate about painting in this style is I don't really need to use references, especially for the plants. I just get to have fun and be creative and kind of just make up whatever plants I want in whatever shape. And a lot of times I don't even have a specific plan for them before I go into it, and it just kind of happens naturally on its own as I start painting, which is really fun. And it's a good way that even if you're painting along with this, you can customize it and make it your own. And your plants don't have to look exactly like mine, they can be their own unique version that is similar or completely different. A lot of the time, I really like doing the color mixing for the leaves while they're still either totally wet or semi-wet, but sometimes I come back once it's totally dry and add a little bit more shadow and depth to each plant if it needs it then, and if it would really enhance the effect like it did for, I don't even know what we call this one, like the bushy giant plant slightly dangling one. It worked really well to add some different colors in after the fact to make it pop out a little bit more. I painted the front of this awning separately from the top layer because I wanted the top one to totally dry. That way they would stand out and they wouldn't just blend together into one big blob. So I made the color a little bit more potent and I painted it after the top had dried. And that way you get that effect of two separate objects that are next to each other instead of just letting the water blur the lines and make it kind of just like a pile of mush. So that's something that can be really effective when you are painting different parts of the same thing that you want part of it to stand out like that. I was torn on if I wanted to add any objects at all into the interior of this little hut. And I decided that I did, but I just don't want them getting a lot of focus. So I'm using really watery mixes of colors that are super similar to the background. So that way it still looks like there is some interest and a little bit of clutter inside, like it's an actual little cafe where someone is working, but I don't want to draw a lot of attention to it. So by working in these really watery little layers, it helps them kind of blend into the background like they exist, but we're not giving all of the attention to these objects because they're not really the point of the scene. This next part is definitely just a personal preference thing, and you do not have to do it if you don't want to. But to make it look like a little bit of ground exists and this cafe actually exists somewhere and isn't just floating in the middle of my white paper, I took some of the colors that I already used and did a really light wash of a ground underneath it to just kind of anchor it down. And remember that this is going to dry a lot later than it looks when you lay it down wet. So it's not going to have a huge impact on your overall picture. It's just going to be a subtle little pop of color to unite it all, make all the objects connected, and kind of bring them all together. It helps if you add a little bit of extra color as a shadow underneath the plants and the building. It gives it a little bit better of an effect, but again, you do not have to do this if you don't want to. As you can tell by how much my candle melted, I took a little break and I let this completely dry before I'm starting to ink it. I'm using a Micron 01 black pen and I'm just trying to really loosely ink this to give it a little bit of dimension and let it pop out. But the thing about this style is you do not want to hold your pen tight. You want to hold it kind of far back and just let the pen do a lot of the work and let it kind of bump around on the paper. And we are definitely not going for perfect here. We're just going for a little bit choppy, a little bit bumpy, wiggly style because it adds a really cute effect to things without making them too perfect, because we are letting go of perfection here and we're just having fun and seeing what happens. So that's one of the best parts about this style is we don't need smooth lines, we don't even need connected lines. They can be a little wiggly and we just are having fun. One of my favorite parts of art is just the freedom that we can find in just kind of letting go and seeing what happens. And it's kind of like magical in a way to just let your materials do some of their own stuff so you're not just perfectly in control of everything. And especially with watercolor, the water kind of has a mind of its own sometimes, and we can go in with a plan and a vision, but it doesn't always go how we want, and sometimes we just see what happens, and sometimes things turn out way better than if you had micromanaged it all and had it all gone perfectly how you hoped. So that's something that's really fun about this type of urban sketching style is there's a lot of freedom and looseness and just kind of having fun with it. I do use a ruler a lot of times with my initial sketch just to make sure things are kind of straight, but by the end, a lot of times things are not perfect, they're not straight, the paint doesn't always go within the lines, but in general, it almost always just works out anyway. Whether you've used this as a tutorial and you've painted alongside me today, or you just watched and listened and we got to hang out, I'm so thankful that you were here and that you watched this video. I hope that you had a nice time and that you got to relax and let your worries go. And we just had a fun time hanging out together as two people. I'm so grateful for you, and I love getting to do this and encourage people to bring art into their life because it's such a positive thing that is really good for you to do. So if you're willing to subscribe or like this video, that would mean so much to me and really helps me out. I hope that you have a wonderful day and we get to do this together again soon.